Hey everyone, it's a pleasure to be here today. And my presentation today is how to win by adapting. So I've got your last half an hour here, and hopefully I can keep you on the edge of your seat with some compelling, thought-provoking content. So let's dive right in. My name's Steve Greenfield, and I'm excited to get started. So to start with, let's talk about the acceleration of technology in general and the effect that it's having on the industry. I think that's going to be a centralized theme today in terms of like there's an increasing pace of technology adoption, basically the industry is having to deal with an increased pace of technology in general affecting us. And if you look back to the beginnings of sort of the industrial revolution with the acceleration pace, we're definitely feeling this within auto. And I would make an argument that we're feeling more technology hit the auto space in the next 5 to 10 years than we've probably felt since the beginning of the advent of the vehicle. If we look at the adoption curve for consumers in terms of embracing e-commerce and online, you'll remember probably this curve from the early days of COVID and the fact that McKinsey showed that we had about 10 years worth of adoption within a few months, just because of this inflection point at the beginning of COVID as people were sheltering in place. And we all felt this very relevantly across the entire automotive ecosystem. And as I've said, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that we will see more change in the next 5 to 10 years than this industry has experienced in the past 100. I try to stay abreast of all of this change and catalog it. And I feel empathy for dealers that I meet with because while they're operating their businesses, it's very hard just to keep up with the pace of change and the news that's being announced on a daily basis. So let's dig right in. So there are a number of changes, and as I categorize those changes across automotive, I think that these 10 categories are probably the right categories, and we're going to spend a little bit of time sort of glancing across the top of these over the next 25 minutes. I'll say if you have questions for me or want to dig into any particular area, please let us know. I will be monitoring the chat. So if you got questions, let us know, and happy to have you take us down a rabbit hole or two along this journey. So the way I look at retail operations now for dealers, and I don't think dealers take offense to this, is we're all kind of operating within this protected bubble where we're seeing more profitability than ever. Last year was more profitable for dealers than ever, and I think this year is tracking, as I'm talking to dealers, tracking to be more profitable, despite the fact that we've got these historical lows of new car inventory. Consumers have been more conditioned not only to not negotiate prices with vehicles, but they've also been conditioned to wait for vehicles, unlike the typical US consumer that wants immediate gratification. But in and around this calmness in this eye of the storm, there are all of these swirling challenges, potential challenges to dealers. What we don't know are the magnitude of those challenges and or how strongly they're going to hit. But it is worthwhile spending a little bit of time looking at those and trying to figure out which ones might have more magnitude and more effect on dealers. And we'll do that today. But back to our theme, as I dug around for good quotes, I think this quote really resonated with me from Charles Darwin. You know, survival of the fittest isn't necessarily the strongest nor the most intelligent, but the one that is most adaptable to change. And I think nothing can resonate more strongly. And to sort of like give you foreshadowing of how we'll wrap up today, I think if nothing else, the retail model, the dealership retail model has been incredibly resilient over the last 100 plus years, hasn't changed very much in a lot of ways. The way that we sort of market, sell, and service vehicles hasn't changed very much over the last 100 years. And I think we're going to see in some of those areas market change over the next 5 to 10 years. But at the same time, if nothing else, this business model has proven that it's very adaptable and as a result, very, very resilient. So let's dig in. So one of my favorite quotes about the future is by a futurist named William Gibson, who said, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed." And my interpretation of this quote is that if you look at the evidence in front of us, we can see breadcrumb trails to help us predict what the future might look like. Sometimes, as I said earlier, these things won't amount to anything, but it's good to pay attention to the news flow because you will see sort of like little green sprigs that might grow into trees. And my job here today is to lay out some of those little green sprigs and not to be able to necessarily prognosticate which will grow into trees, but at least lay that out to provide a framework. So let's talk about build to order. If nothing else, through COVID, we've learned that consumers have now been much more conditioned and open to waiting for vehicles. So whether that's passenger vehicles or commercial vehicles, we know that because of supply chain issues, first COVID shutting down factories, then microchip issues, and now more recently other supply chain issues, the consumer in the US has been much more conditioned to wait for vehicles. We've also learned that the entire supply chain, everything from OEMs down to dealers, when cars can be built to order and sold at or above MSRP, there's a good cascading effect for profitability across the entire supply chain. We've seen records with new car prices, record wait times for vehicles, and record quarter profitability for both OEMs and dealers. And it will be in the entire supply chain's best interest if they're able to maintain that balance between supply and demand coming out of COVID and microchip shortages, et cetera. And the OEMs are taking the opportunity to try to figure out, as they launch more EVs, if there are opportunities for them to control more of the consumer experience in the spirit of better matching supply to demand and keeping profitability strong. So we're seeing, for example, some of the OEMs as they launch new EVs to drive consumers to these websites where they effectively reserve the vehicle, sometimes putting down money and sometimes not. And but if in any case, then inserting a dealer who will be the point of delivery, but definitely having more control and more consumer interaction than what would be typical for retailers in the past. We've seen more OEMs either take a strong interest in and or declare, as Volvo has here, that they're going to start to centralize inventory in geographies. And the dealers themselves may not be stocking any inventory on their lots, which should reduce inventory cost carrying, but also potentially advertising costs. If the OEMs want to own advertising to the consumer, driving the consumers to an OEM branded website, then they may be trying to encourage the dealers over some time frame to actually reduce their marketing costs. And the flip side of that may be that dealers start to feel less incentives from the OEMs in terms of inventory carrying incentives and advertising incentives. But this agency model, which is popular overseas, in Europe specifically, we're going to see more OEMs taking an interest in potentially pushing more of an agency model, a centralized stock model in the US. In terms of the consumer experience, I think we can unilaterally blame this gentleman 25 years ago at the beginning of the internet for setting enhanced expectations of consumers across all commerce segments, and definitely the trickle into automotive in terms of enhanced expectations. And I would argue that this gentleman, who's gotten a lot of news lately around Twitter specifically, really drafted in behind what Jeff Bezos was able to prove out with a very Amazon-esque experience, and modeled their new car shopping experience online largely after Amazon. And the rest of the industry looks at that and holds that up as sort of the utopian endpoint and has tried to react to that. And Carvana, as much negative press as they've gotten recently, has really done nothing more than say, if we were going to apply an Amazon-like model to used car shopping, what might that look like? And for a great deal of their history has been rewarded handsomely in the stock market up until this last quarter's performance, where they had some challenges, and the stock has been pummeled considerably over the last couple of weeks as a result. But what these companies have done is to path sort of a new reality for any of the manufacturers that are new, and then have the luxury of debating whether or not they want to invest in a dealer network. And we see companies like Rivian coming to market and deciding, hey, Tesla's already protested a lot of these state franchise laws. So as a result, they've decided to move forward without a dealer network. Now, the pros and cons we could debate, Clearly, it's more challenging to service vehicles if you don't have a local dealer network, but it does remove costs and allow the OEM potentially to capture more margin when they can sell directly to consumers. Let's talk about electric vehicle adoption as we're on electric vehicle here. The most aggressive consultant that I've seen in the space has been McKinsey, proclaiming that they believe that about half of the passenger vehicles sold in the US will be EVs by 2030. And for a multitude of reasons that we'll get into a little bit here today, I question whether the US consumer is prepared to start trading in their ICE vehicles for EVs for the reasons that, as you can imagine. But I do believe on the commercial side of things, we will see, especially on short distance fixed routes, we'll see much more of an adoption and towards EVs than we will see with US passenger vehicles in the US. In terms of the percentage of vehicles sold, EV versus ICE, it's still a very small percentage overall. As you can imagine, on a small base, the percentage increases on a quarter-to-quarter basis look very aggressive. But in terms of the actual overall pool of vehicles that are being sold every year, the percentage of EVs is quite small. But despite that, many of the OEMs have proclaimed that they're going to go all in on EVs. In this case, GM saying that by 2035, they'll be 100% EV. Mercedes saying that after 2025, every new platform that they launch will be EV. Chrysler will be 100% EV by 2028. I question how much of these messages that the CEOs are sending to Wall Street are to appease Wall Street versus the reality that are we going to have the demand from consumers and commercial buyers to actually go 100% EV. And as you've heard many times in the press, a lot of the challenges that people have with moving from ICE to EV are around range, charging infrastructure availability, the time to charge, and the cost. And I think those things we will see a lot of progression around battery technologies and charging speed, et cetera. But until such time as we can assuage people's fears around running out of charge on the road and having enough infrastructure to actually charge vehicles at a fast rate, cost aside, when we'll get into sort of the cost of batteries and the raw inputs going up recently because of demand, I think that there still is going to be a lot of resistance. And to me, it seems like a little aggressive to believe that consumers are going to be willing to switch 100% from internal combustion engines to EVs. And there are big opportunities and big challenges potentially for dealers. As we look at sort of the complexity of the drivetrain, the engine and the drivetrain for an internal combustion engine vehicle on the left versus an ICE vehicle or an EV vehicle on the right, there's a lot fewer moving parts, fewer moving parts to fail. The service intervals are going to be a lot longer because you don't need to come in for regular oil changes or spark plugs with these vehicles. The one thing that seems to be playing out is tire changes are actually more frequent, not only because these vehicles weigh more and put more load on the tires because of weight, but because there's so much more torque generated that if you've got an aggressive driver, the combination of more weight and more torque will burn through tires more frequently. So there will be opportunities for dealers to see consumers more often in terms of tire changes, but the regular service, high margin service, will be much less frequent, which will be more of a strain on dealers' economics because a lot of their profitability, as you know, comes from parts and service. And then as we look at the actual parts spend for a battery electric vehicle on the far right versus an internal combustion engine vehicle, it's about 40% less over the life of the vehicle. So OEMs, as we know, make a large profit centers out of selling original OEM parts. And given these vehicles will, one, have fewer parts and two, have longer service intervals, is going to be a bit of a double whammy. So not only will dealers feel the pain of seeing these cars less frequently and selling less service and parts, but so will the OEMs. And this is articulated by dealers. This is a Nissan dealer that said, look, because I'm going to be seeing these EVs much less frequently, I'm going to actually need to see more upfront profit margin on the vehicles in order to offset that to be whole on my profitability overall. And the way I kind of look at it is that the puts and calls or the pros and cons of moving from ICE to EV in the fleet is sort of neutral to me, right? At the very bottom, as I said, we're going to be able to potentially see consumers more often to replace tires. I know tires are a low margin accessory, but at least we'll be able to see consumers more often, which will offset the fact that these vehicles are going to have fewer moving parts and longer service intervals and less part sales. But if these EVs at the top are going to be able to sell more frequently at MSRP, and the prices, at least for the time being, are higher, it's more likely that the consumer is going to buy protection, insurance protection, for example, gap insurance to protect them against the depreciation, the immediate depreciation of the vehicle, and probably allow, at least in the interim, dealers to make higher front-end gross profits, simply because if the OEM's controlling the relationship with the consumer, chances are the consumer is going to be paying full MSRP for these vehicles, which up until recently hasn't typically been the case. Most new vehicles don't sell at or above MSRP. And if that can be maintained, there may actually be more front-end gross profit for the dealer overall. So net, I think that there's pros and cons as we move to more of an electrified fleet, but we'll have to keep a watchful eye on these dynamics. And then it's worth saying, as I said earlier, in terms of the inputs into these batteries and also recycling the raw constituents of the batteries afterwards, there are a number of companies working on trying to reclaim the battery components afterwards, so we don't have to worry about just mining all of these raw from the earth. And some of the OEMs are investing pretty heavily into these technologies, as you can imagine. And the last thing I'll say about inputs is, very astutely, China 15 years ago or so foresaw how this might play out and made bets by looking to control much of the inputs into batteries today. So it's concerning from a geopolitical standpoint that China, an emerging economic power, controls much of the inputs into batteries globally. And so there will be much more talk in the near term about the US trying to find ways of getting independence from China's control of all of these battery inputs. And as you can imagine, the combination of China's control over inputs and the shift to EVs, the actual raw inputs into battery inputs has taken off recently from a cost standpoint. So while the hope was we'd be quickly at parity between ICE vehicles and EV vehicles from a cost standpoint, it looks like that isn't going to happen anytime soon, because as we're seeing inflation across many other categories in the economy, inflation is really hitting the raw inputs into batteries overall. A question from Chris: with many EV truck manufacturers selling direct and the lower maintenance required, what does that mean for traditional dealers and service departments? Yeah, I think, Chris, I did talk a little bit about that, but just to be clear, I think that the dealers are going to have to get much more creative. For example, I'm talking to dealers who are trying to have guaranteed for life tire programs, knowing that the consumers are going to replace tires on these vehicles more often because they're heavier and have more torque, to offset these longer service intervals. Talking to some of the F&I product providers to see if there are new insurance products that dealers might be able to sell at the point of sale to encourage the consumers to come back in and be more loyal afterwards. In a few minutes, I'll get to the service, but I do believe as these vehicles become dangerous to work on because of the voltage, one, the complexity is going to be a lot higher. And I think that the skill of the technicians and the tools that are needed to be used for these vehicles are going to mean that what is typical at the end of a warranty period, where consumers or fleet owners could defect and work on their own vehicles, I think actually we're going to see the countervailing force, which is consumers and fleet owners are going to have to come back to an OEM approved franchise dealer to work on these vehicles, simply because they're going to be so complex and dangerous to work on if you don't have a skilled technician and the right tools to work on these vehicles, which should drive more loyalty through service longer term. A great question. Let's shift to autonomy. If we looked a few years ago, many consulting firms thought that by this point, we'd have half the cars that were being sold and on surface streets being fully autonomous. And we get to sort of level 4, where you can literally take a nap in the back seat. The difference between level 4 and level 5 is you can take a nap in the back seat in the middle of a snowstorm in level 5. They can deal with very adverse situations. And but we really haven't gotten there yet. Much to counter sort of Elon Musk's quote unquote full self-driving. It's not full self-driving. We see evidence of that every day in some of these crashes that are taking place. And I think that we're a long way from having full level 4 or level 5 on the roads for personal use. However, as I'm going to tell you in a minute, we are seeing much more adoption quicker on commercial and taking humans out of the driver's seat. So why is this? Well, I think it's really four interconnected issues, which is just regulations, government regulations, the technology readiness. There still has to be a lot more progress made around miles driven and the technology. Business case attractiveness, and as I'll talk about, some of the most attractive business cases around autonomy right now are more on the commercial side and not the retail side. And then consumer preferences overall. I think it's going to take another generation, probably, of all of us before a younger generation will step in a car without a steering wheel, without a brake pedal, and have trust that this vehicle isn't going to get into an accident. But as I said, on the commercial side of things, we're seeing a lot of progress quickly. So in controlled environments where there aren't humans, moving cargo around ports, in controlled factories, within distribution centers, et cetera, shuttling on controlled courses back and forth between a distribution center and a retail outlet, we're seeing much more progression quicker. And I think it's not going to be long before we start to see convoys on the road where you're going to see like a human driving the first 18-wheeler, but probably 5 to 7 18-wheelers tucked in behind that human that don't have drivers that obey that first. So you can kind of think of a train, but sort of a train with one conductor, one driver, with multiple 18-wheelers tucked in behind them on the roads. And we will start to see evidence of that pretty soon. You're seeing FedEx, test in Texas, running autonomous vehicles between Dallas and Houston. For the time being, there's a human behind the wheel that can intervene if needed, but eventually, the hope would be that they can take the human out of the equation. And especially for like non-human cargo, you're seeing these low speed sort of autonomous vehicles. In this case, a company called Nuro, which is going to be able to deliver your groceries to you. You'll be able to go out, swipe your phone over that little receptacle in the middle, and go retrieve your groceries. So for low speed and non-human cargo, I think we're going to see a lot of progress soon about autonomy. Let's transition to connected cars. If you pay attention to GM Mary Barra's CEO Mary Barra's investor conference that she held back in October of last year, she started to talk more about the vehicle being a piece of hardware like our phone and selling services on top of it, like an app store. And at that October conference, she said, look, today GM generates about $2 billion a year in subscription services. It's all called OnStar. But they want to grow that $2 billion to $25 billion over the next 8 years, going to 2030. And a lot of that will be from usage-based insurance. So 6 of that 25, in addition to OnStar, will be from usage-based insurance that the consumer will be sold at the point of sale. And based on their driving patterns, they may earn the right to have reduced insurance. In addition to subscription services, there's been more talk recently about over-the-air updates. So if you remember back a couple of years ago, there were 2 incidences with Tesla. One where when the Tesla Model S first came out, it was picking up road debris and damaging the undercarriage and the battery packs. And they did an over-the-air update, which raised the vehicle at driving speeds on the highway an inch or 2, so it wouldn't intercept debris off the roads. And then more relevantly, when the Model 3 first came out and Consumer Reports panned this new Tesla model because its braking was worse than a Ford F-150, Elon Musk, as he does, went to Twitter and was very irritated by Consumer Reports. Within a few days, they pushed an over-the-air update. He asked Consumer Reports to retest those same vehicles, and they found that the cars with one software push were now braking much more competitively than they were just a few days prior, which really opened up the eyes of the industry in terms of over-the-air updates and what else we're going to be able to do in the future. Well, the interesting thing, if you look at the warranty work that's done, by one researcher, ABI researcher, they believe about a third of the warranty work and recall work can go away simply through software updates, which is going to mean fewer visits back to the dealership, where the dealership is going to be able to do two things, typically, upsell the consumer or the fleet owner additional work and engender more of a long-term lifetime value of the customer. Well, if these vehicles, a third of the time, these things can be rectified by over-the-air updates to people's driveways overnight, then it's going to be much more profitable OEM, but much less work for dealers to have in their service base. So let me drive towards conclusion. I've got a couple of minutes left. I think that the truth is this was a very astute observation by McKinsey, back to just the rate of change affecting the dealership model. I think that we are in an environment of increasing disruption. There'll be more technology innovation, which could provide opportunities and or threat. But the dealers need to be on their best game to potentially unlock operational efficiencies and also find new ways to innovatively generate revenue. Back to the 10 themes, I think all of these are out there swirling around. What we don't know is the magnitude of these themes and if and when they'll hit. But unlike a lot of people in the industry, I don't think there's a big asteroid coming to blow up and disrupt the entire automotive industry. Coming back to where we started with this gentleman, Charles Darwin, I actually believe that running an operation, a dealership operation, is a lot like squeezing a water-filled balloon. And what I mean by that, if you look sort of a bird's eye view of a dealership actually has between 5 to 7 different profit and loss operations. And over the last 15 to 20 years, for example, you look at the importance that some of the profit centers, like selling insurance products or selling service, has taken. Service and parts now is more than half of a dealer's profitability, whereas that would not have been the case 15 or 20 years ago. They would have been much more reliant on how much margin they made on the front end of the new car sale or the used vehicle sale. Now, dealers have very astutely and creatively been able to move around, allocate resources differently, drive revenue from different departments within their operations, and drive profitability from different areas of their operations. So I think as these pressures mount across certain areas of the dealership, the dealer operation, we're going to be able to see that I believe that the dealers will continue to be resilient and adaptable and allocate resources to ensure that they continue to eke out strong profitability.